What was interesting is you know, Richard said you gotta talk to my partner. He's totally into this stuff, and I called this guy, and we'll just call him, you know, Don for tonight or whatever. But I called Don, not his real name, and I interviewed him over the phone.
We call him Mr. K in the film.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, it's a very bizarre story, and people can say anything. And at one point, I asked him point blank. I said, "Well, do you know who Steve Quayle is?" And he said, "No, I don't know who Steve Quayle is." And so, well, you've never heard anything about this, about what Steve Quayle discovered. And I mailed him an audio tape of Steve Quayle on Coast to Coast talking about this giant that they had discovered, that was shipped out. And Quayle's contact was the pilot who came on the record with Quayle and talked about that he flew this thing out of Afghanistan. That's what he talks about, all right?
And that was back in 2008, 8 years ago.
So this was different. He was telling me 2002. And this man lives in an area where we had an ongoing archaeological dig, and I won't tell you the state. And so, by coincidence, he was about an hour's drive from the dig site. And so I said, well, why don't you meet me at the dig site and we'll talk? Because, you know, one thing over the phone, it's another thing face-to-face. I met this guy. He was a little nervous, but he told the same story. And every time on the phone, and I talked to him on the phone, you know, several times before we, you know, before we met face-to-face, every time when he got to this one point in the story, and it's on camera the same way, there was, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but the story is simply this, that, and let me back up a little bit. There's a platoon that goes missing, a patrol that goes missing. They're out looking for high-value targets in the mountains of Afghanistan, 2002. They go missing. They don't report back in. So after like 12 hours, another platoon, another group of soldiers are helicoptered into the same area, same landing part, to find what happened to the first guys. They're walking in very rugged terrain, very mountainous. They come down this like goat trail, which turns to the left, and they see that there's a mouth of a cave. And as they're doing that, the ground is littered with what our friend Dan thinks is bones, and he sees a piece of communications. And at this point, he's thinking like, you know, wild animal, what's going on? What comes out of the cave is a 12 to 15 foot giant with red hair, and he's got this lance, a pike, with him, and everybody's just stunned. Who wouldn't be? The training, you know, doesn't.
You're trained. You're told monsters don't exist, and then all of a sudden, it's right there.
And
yeah, and this dude is really huge, like 2 or 3 times the size of a normal person.
And when you got to understand something, when you go up a foot, I got a picture of myself standing next to a 7-footer. I'm a quarter-inch under 6 feet, and next to me is a 7-foot former basketball player. I look like a midget next to this guy, and I'm not exaggerating. I show it at conferences because people have no idea. You double that? Let's be conservative.
I know. Not just double that. What about the weight? Because if you double 200 pounds, you're 400 pounds. But this beast was what, 1,200 pounds?
1,100 pounds, we think.
That
according
is insane. That's half a ton.
That's according to the pilot that flew him out, because they knew they had probably about 400 pounds worth of hardware to tie this creature down, cargo netting and a pallet to put him on and all that. So all of that weighed 1,500 pounds with the giant on top of it.
Now, think about how much muscle mass could be in this creature. I mean, to have the ability to rip a human body in shreds, I mean, it just boggles my mind. So when people think, you know, giant, we're not just talking about, you know, the height. You know, think about body mass index and the strength, as we mentioned. I mean, and what was this about soldiers being told, instead of doing your traditional double tap of one to the chest, one to the head, where they were told to shoot above the head?
Bingo. And that was from our second witness, but we're getting way ahead of the story. The bottom line is, as the men, the patrol, are stunned by this giant coming out of the cave, Captain Dan or Lieutenant Dan, whatever this guy was, which was one, you know, apparently this guy was the first guy to break out of the trance. he starts firing. The giant moves with such speed and agility that it stuns everybody. And before anybody can do anything, the giant with this lance, which was what, 10 to 12 feet tall, has skewered Dan and is holding him up with one hand. Now, what's interesting is every single time in the pre-interviews that we got to this point, our witness would choke. He would lose it on the phone. Every single time he got to that part of the story. One time he just hung up on me, and then he called me back 5 minutes later. So here I am face to face with him now, and he's telling me the story, and sure enough, he gets to the part, and I watch people. I look for body language. I look at the eyes. I watch the hands. I look at the shoulders. Everything. He's just all part of being, an interviewer.
Yes.
To see it's this guy, and he was obviously shook up every time that we got to that part in the pre-interviews. He would lose it, and then on camera, the same thing. He loses it on camera. He gets choked up at the same part. What people don't understand is this thing was real. And at this point, Dan, Captain Dan is on the pike. I mean, he's been impaled. And someone says, shoot him in the face, shoot him in the face. And they all start firing at this guy with advanced weaponry, 308s, 47s, the whole deal, a 50 cal. I mean, they're just opening fire on this thing, and they kill it. And later on, as they're waiting to get medevac out of there, which turns into a non-medevac because Dan passed away, he died, they come to their senses. He describes the stench as being as powerful as a skunk, but not a skunk, something totally different. And what was interesting is I was at a conference, and this is where our second witness comes in, who was also ex-military, who also served in Afghanistan 3 years later. In the Kandahar province is where this giant came from. And I said, did you ever hear any rumors about a giant in Kandahar? And he just looked at me and he said, is this on the record or off the record? I said, well, will you come on the record? And he said, I will, but anonymously. I said, okay, what do you got? And he said, everyone knew about the giant at Kandahar. Everyone talked about it, but you weren't supposed to talk about it. That some giant had been killed in a cave a couple of years earlier. I mean, people knew about it. So now we got two witnesses, which is basically vetting Steve Quayle's story.
You called me from a conference telling me you had met this guy randomly that had this experience, and I said, can we interview him? Because then we had like two military guys supporting of the same story.
And I mean, and that's all in Watchers 10. There's also some behind-the-scenes stuff in the book Nephilim Hybrid, but it all just overlaps and dovetails together. And what's important about this is it raises more questions than it answers. For instance, this thing had 6 fingers and 6 toes. It had flaming red hair. By all accounts, and even George Norrie states it live on a Skype interview, which is in Watchers 10, that interview with George. And thank you, George, for coming on the record with us. But George Norrie states, L.A., it sounds just like the biblical Nephilim. And I concur and say, yeah, that's why we're so interested in it. 6 fingers, 6 toes, red hair, 12 feet tall. And we know that, like Ishbi-Benob or Goliath, these giants that we hear about in the biblical narrative were 10, 12 feet tall.